Hey guys, ready for another Last Climb episode? Today I'll go over the brutal reality of Everest's death zone, where one influencer refused oxygen again and again because she thought it ruined selfies. Her guide begged, her body screamed, but the phone always won. What thin air did to her mind once she could no longer tell up from down will chill you to the bone. May 23rd, 2021. That was the day. The weather window everyone had been waiting for had finally opened on the south side of Mount Everest. And after the mountain had been closed to foreign climbers during the 2020 season, climbers from all over the world were finally getting their shot at the summit. Base camp had been buzzing for days. Teams were checking gear, checking weather reports, checking and rechecking oxygen bottles. Because on a mountain like this, that gear is the only thing standing between a person and the thin, freezing nothing above 26,000 feet. Everybody who set out that morning believed they were about to have the best day of their life. And for most of them, they were right. But for one climber in a bright pink down suit, the mountain had already decided otherwise. Her name was Brianna DuPont. She was 28 years old from France, and she had built a career out of being looked at. She was a lifestyle influencer with a following that had grown fast, and Everest was supposed to be the crown jewel of her content calendar, the kind of trip that would separate her from every other creator posting beach photos and brunch reviews. She had trained for months. She had hired one of the most respected guiding outfits on the mountain. She had a personal Sherpa guide named Akar, a man who had already stood on the summit 10 times and who had guided dozens of clients safely up and down that same route. On paper, she had every advantage a paying climber could ask for. What she did not seem to understand, or maybe did not want to understand, was that Everest does not care how many followers a person has. When I research these kinds of stories, it's a little sad to know that we live in a world now where the point of doing something incredible is often to prove that you did it, to have the photo, the clip, the caption. And most of the time, that's harmless. Nobody gets hurt because they took an extra selfie at a waterfall or a rooftop bar. But some environments punish that instinct in ways that are completely unforgiving. And the death zone on Everest might be the least forgiving environment on the entire planet. Up there, the phone in your hand and the mask on your face are competing for the same few minutes of your life, and only one of them can actually keep you breathing. By around 8:15 that morning, Brianna and Akar had reached the section of the route just below the summit that climbers still call the Hillary Step, even though the actual rock step collapsed years earlier in an earthquake. What is left is a steep, exposed stretch of snow and rock, and on a day like this one, it becomes a bottleneck, because everyone chasing the summit has to funnel through the same narrow line. The morning light was already up, though a few headlamps still glowed in the shadowed pockets of the route. The wind was mild for the altitude, but mild at 28,000 feet still means brutal. The air pressure up there is only about a third of what it is at sea level, leaving the body with far less oxygen available to absorb. Without a supplemental tank strapped to your back, your brain and your muscles are both working under severe hypoxic stress at the same time. The more I picture myself standing in that line, the harder this part is to ignore. Everyone else in that line understood the assignment. They stood there, masks on, conserving whatever energy their bodies had left, because they knew the summit push was still hours away, and the real danger wasn't the climb up, it was the walk back down. Brianna was different. She was excited, and honestly, who wouldn't be? But excitement at that altitude is a liability if it makes you forget where you are. She was already breathing hard through her mask, and anyone paying attention could see the fatigue creeping into her movements. This was not a woman who was cruising. This was a woman who was already spending energy she didn't have to spare. Akar kept checking her regulator, making sure the oxygen was actually flowing the way it should. Over the radio, he told her plainly that they needed to wait, that the line could take close to an hour to clear, and that she needed to keep her mask on and save her strength, because this moment mattered. She nodded along. But as the line crept forward, inch by inch, she reached up and pulled her mask down so it hung loose around her neck. The second that mask came off, her breathing changed. She was gulping air with far less oxygen available to her body, and she probably knew it, because she must have immediately started breathing harder. But she smiled anyway, because the camera doesn't know you're hypoxic. It just sees a smile. She pulled out her phone right there in the middle of the bottleneck and recorded herself talking about the traffic jam on the Hillary Step, like it was a funny inconvenience on a road trip, instead of one of the most dangerous stretches of terrain on the planet. She took selfies, playfully acting cold for the camera, while people around her were quietly trying to survive the altitude. I can understand why she did it, even knowing exactly how dangerous it was. She was excited and 28 years old on the trip of a lifetime. But the truth doesn't change just because I understand the impulse. Every second without oxygen up there was increasing the hypoxic strain on an already exhausted body, and repeatedly removing the mask while exerting herself could make her deterioration worse. And look, I get why the content mattered to her. This was probably the biggest moment of her career, maybe the biggest moment of her entire life, and the instinct to capture it isn't crazy on its own. The problem is that Everest doesn't grade on intention. It doesn't care that she wasn't trying to be careless, or that in almost any other setting on the planet, pulling your mask down for 30 seconds to take a photo would be a complete non-issue. Up there, 30 seconds isn't nothing. 30 seconds without supplemental oxygen can sharply increase the strain of hypoxia, especially during exertion, and repeated interruptions could contribute to her worsening condition, whether she was thinking about it or not. A car eventually reached over and gently pushed the mask back toward her face, telling her they needed the oxygen on, please. She put it back on, but the pattern repeated. They would move forward another 30 feet or so, and she would pull the mask down again for another clip. This happened at least 4 more times over the course of that hour. A guide from another company named Mark Ellison was climbing just ahead of her with his own client. According to the accounts later pieced together, Mark glanced back at one point, saw what she was doing, and told her flatly to keep her oxygen on before turning back around to focus on his own client. He wasn't trying to be rude. On that mountain, at that altitude, nobody has spare breath for a long lecture. A few climbers back in that same line was a doctor named Helena Petrova, a Russian physician summiting as part of a research expedition. She wasn't Brianna's doctor, and she had no obligation to intervene at that point, but she noticed the pattern too, and it worried her in a clinical way. She could see a woman burning through her physical reserves in the death zone, the unofficial name climbers use for anything above about 26,000 feet, where the human body cannot fully acclimatize to the altitude. Prolonged exposure there places enormous physiological stress on the body. Every minute without full oxygen support in that zone increases that stress, and Helena watched Brianna do this to herself again and again, apparently without fully grasping what she was risking. I find myself thinking about Helena's role in this story a lot, because it's easy to forget how much responsibility can suddenly fall on a total stranger in an environment like this. She had her own summit push to manage, her own team to look after, her own oxygen supply to ration. And yet she was already, at this early point in the day, mentally filing away concerns about a woman she had never met. That's the culture of high-altitude climbing, whether people realize it or not. Everyone up there is watching everyone else, not out of nosiness, but because a stranger's bad decision 200 feet ahead of you can turn into your emergency an hour later. Eventually, Akar stopped being gentle about it. He told her there would be no more photos without her oxygen on, and that if she kept taking the mask off, they would turn around. When Brianna argued that they were already so close to the summit, Akar radioed his expedition leader and reported that she was repeatedly removing oxygen and beginning to slow. The instruction came back clearly. If her condition deteriorated, turn her around. Akar told Brianna the same thing. For the moment though, she put the mask back on and seemed to improve enough to keep moving. With the bottleneck still crowded and climbers packed tightly onto the fixed line, immediately reversing direction wasn't simple either. Akar decided they would continue only to the next safe turnaround point, where he could reassess her without blocking the route. I actually find myself feeling a little sorry for her here, because she had been warned and genuinely seemed to think she understood what Akar was telling her. She probably just hadn't internalized, not really, that this mountain was going to make her pay for every mistake immediately and without mercy. The sun kept climbing over the Himalayan peaks around them, gorgeous and indifferent, while the line of climbers kept inching toward a summit that some of them would never leave. By around 9:30, the traffic had thinned enough that the group could move at something closer to a normal pace, but Brianna's normal pace was gone. She had stopped chatting with Akar. When he asked her something, she answered in single words or grunts, and her movements were becoming noticeably less coordinated. Akar slowed the pace and reassessed her, then radioed his expedition leader again. The summit was only a few hundred feet higher, but by normal commercial expedition standards, she was already late and deteriorating. Akar later told investigators he believed he could get her to the summit and immediately down, but that judgment became one of the most painful questions in the review. He told Brianna they would stop and turn around at the next safe point if she worsened. They reached a flatter stretch of snow and ice, and Brianna stopped walking. She had found her shot. This, she decided, was the spot for her summit photo. She waved Akar to a stop and pointed toward the peak in the distance, telling him this was the one, this was going to be the shot. And once again, off came the mask. Her hands were shaking as she tried to work the clasp with gloves on, shivering, pulling the phone out from inside her suit to fire off a dozen photos, turning this way and that to catch the light. Akar told her they needed to move, that she was slowing down too much, that the mask needed to go back on right now. She told him she was fine, just a few more, her voice sounding thinner and further away than it had an hour earlier. Now buckle up. This next part is where things really started to go wrong, and it's almost painfully avoidable in hindsight. When she finally tried to put the mask back on, her fingers were too stiff and clumsy from the cold to manage it. The combination of bulky gloves, cold, and worsening coordination made reconnecting the mask difficult. She fumbled with it for almost 3 full minutes before she got it working again. And during that entire stretch, she was breathing nothing but thin mountain air while her body sat above 28,000 feet. 3 minutes doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud. Up there, 3 minutes without supplemental oxygen can substantially worsen hypoxia, particularly in someone already exhausted, but it does not by itself mean that brain swelling has begun. Dr. Petrova passed the pair not long after and noticed that, although Brianna's mask was back on, her breathing was rapid and heavy, and her movements had turned jerky and uncoordinated. Those signs were now highly concerning for serious altitude illness, particularly because her coordination was deteriorating. A minute or so later, Mark Ellison came through with his own client and paused just long enough to ask Akar if everything was okay. Akar told him she was slow and that they had been instructed to turn around if she worsened. Mark looked at her for a second, gave Akar a quick nod, and continued on with his own client. Akar radioed his expedition leader again, increasingly impaired. The instruction was to get her to the next safe point and begin the descent if she could no longer move normally. Akar got Brianna moving again, and they continued toward the summit. If I were watching Brianna from a few yards away, I would have wanted someone to stop her. This is not worth it. And in hindsight, Akar's decision to keep going became one of the central questions after the incident. He had warned her, contacted his expedition leader, and been told to turn her around if she deteriorated. But Brianna would briefly improve whenever the mask was secured and the route ahead was still congested. At that altitude, with a client who was still walking and a safe turnaround point difficult to reach immediately, Akar made the judgment that he could get her to the summit and begin the descent without delay. That judgment would later be criticized. Nothing had catastrophically failed yet. It was a series of increasingly questionable decisions that kept moving Brianna closer to the point where something would. It also makes me think about how invisible the damage was in the moment. Removing supplemental oxygen for a few minutes doesn't automatically produce permanent brain injury, and there is no stopwatch that tells you when haste begins. But Brianna was already at extreme altitude, already exhausted, and increasingly uncoordinated. Those factors made the repeated hypoxia increasingly dangerous, and the person experiencing altitude illness can have impaired judgment precisely when good judgment matters most. Brianna reached the summit sometime around 11 that morning. By normal commercial expedition standards, that was already late for a summit push, especially for a climber who had been visibly deteriorating. Akar did not treat the summit as a victory lap. He told her they had reached their turnaround point and that they needed to descend immediately. Brianna managed to stand and take a handful of photos, but there was no lingering celebration and no extended summit stop. Her eyes had gone glassy, and she leaned heavily on her ice axe just to remain upright. Akar kept urging her to move because the descent, not the summit itself, was now the emergency. Now here's a detail from the investigation afterward that I think says everything about what altitude does to the mind. Doctor? Petrova arrived at the summit with her own team, briefly documented the conditions for her expedition's records, and turned to head back down. That's when she noticed Brianna sitting alone in the snow, slumped over, away from the main flow of climbers, and no longer even on the fixed route. Helena walked over and asked if she was okay, and asked where her Sherpa guide was. Brianna reportedly mumbled something about looking for the line, the trail, as if she had completely lost track of where she was standing, on the actual summit of Mount Everest. That single detail is one of the clearest signs of severe altitude illness and impaired coordination, and Helena recognized it immediately. This is the moment when, for me, Brianna's mistakes stop being the main story. What matters now is that she is having a medical emergency in one of the least accessible places on Earth. Helena quickly checked Brianna's responsiveness, her breathing, her pulse, and her coordination, and everything pointed toward a severe altitude illness highly concerning for high-altitude cerebral edema, where the brain develops potentially life-threatening swelling associated with severe hypoxia and altitude exposure. It's rare, but it's also one of the deadliest conditions you can develop above 25,000 feet, because the only real treatment is getting down fast, and there was no fast way down from where they stood. Helena gave her a dose of a steroid called dexamethasone from her own medical kit, a drug that can temporarily improve symptoms and buy time while descent is initiated, and radioed for help while calling a car over. Akar rushed to Brianna's side, checked that she was still properly clipped into the fixed rope system, and told her firmly that they had to go right now, that she was confused and needed to move. He radioed his expedition communications team again, reporting her condition and confirming that he was beginning the descent. With the route still carrying other climbers, he kept Brianna secured in a position beside the fixed line, rather than leaving her directly in the main traffic path. And with that, her descent began. It wasn't a climb down anymore. It was a slow, uneven shuffle, the walk of someone whose body had stopped fully listening to her brain, or maybe whose brain had stopped fully working at all. The summit photos are haunting because Brianna looked completely fine while a potentially fatal brain injury was already developing inside her. The camera captured the version of her everyone could see, not what was happening beneath the surface. The hours that followed, roughly noon to 3 in the afternoon, were when everything unraveled completely. A car kept her attached to the fixed rope system and supported her as best he could, helping guide her feet over rock steps she could no longer navigate on her own. Her legs kept buckling. Her coordination was gone, and her oxygen, the one resource standing between her and total collapse, was running out fast because Akar had already increased her flow rate to compensate for how badly she was deteriorating. He checked the gauge on her remaining cylinder and found it nearly empty. Akar radioed his expedition team, reporting that Brianna's oxygen was nearly depleted at around 27,000 feet and that she needed immediate help. The extra bottle he carried had already been used, while the next reliable oxygen cache was lower on the mountain. The communications team began contacting climbers and Sherpas higher up to find someone who could bring oxygen or assistance, but at 27,000 feet, there was no simple helicopter rescue. Any evacuation still depended on exhausted people carrying her down. Brianna eventually stopped walking, disoriented and unable to recognize the route, asking where the lodge was. Too impaired to move reliably, she had to be pulled forward by Akar, who radioed the expedition team for help and oxygen. Mark Ellison, descending with his client after summiting, encountered them again and immediately recognized the severity of her condition. When he asked about her oxygen, Akar gave him the answer he feared. It was empty. Mark assessed the terrain, his exhausted client, and Brianna's condition. When Akar admitted he could not move her alone, Mark radioed their location and reported that Brianna could no longer walk and had no oxygen. He told Akar he could not take Brianna while still responsible for his own client, but confirmed that her condition and position had been reported. Mark then continued his descent. Climbers sometimes describe the area above 26,000 feet as the death zone, where rescue becomes dramatically more dangerous. A healthy climber can exhaust their own limited reserves trying to help someone else, turning one emergency into two. It does not excuse what happened to Brianna, but at that altitude, the human body has very little capacity for prolonged rescue efforts. I know how that sounds when you say it plainly. A dying woman and a capable climber just kept walking. But I think it's worth sitting with the reality of what a rescue actually requires up there instead of judging it through the lens of an action movie. An unconscious or barely responsive adult cannot be safely carried down technical, icy, rope-fixed terrain by one or two exhausted people without very likely killing all of them in the process. A couple of other climbers passing by asked Akar if he needed help, and after hearing that she couldn't walk, they looked at the terrain, looked at their own partners, and kept moving too. Those climbers could realistically have relayed her location and condition by radio, and Akar's expedition was already receiving reports from descending teams. The problem was not that nobody knew where she was. The problem was that reaching her with enough oxygen and manpower to move her safely required another person to climb back into terrain where every additional minute exposed them to the same risks. Akar kept trying anyway. He kept her clipped to the fixed line while attempting to guide her feet, shouting at her to stand up, asking her if she wanted to die, his own strength draining with every minute. She reportedly murmured back that she was just so tired, so incredibly tired. Eventually, she sat down in the snow beside the rope and simply stopped trying to move at all. The words Brianna used here bother me because there was nothing alarming about them on the surface. So tired. Almost anyone might say that after a long day, a long shift, a long drive, it's not a scream, it's not a cry for help in the way we imagine one. That's what makes this so dangerous. Altitude sickness can make a life-threatening emergency sound completely mundane, so the person saying it and the person hearing it can both underestimate exactly how far gone things already are. By around 3 in the afternoon, they remained on an exposed section of the upper route, with winds strengthening and temperatures falling. Brianna was no longer responding, and a car struggled to keep her upright. Dr. Petrova caught up, assessed Brianna as unconscious with slow, shallow breathing, and signs strongly concerning for haste. She confirmed that dexamethasone had already been given, but warned that without oxygen and immediate descent, there was little more she could do. Akar insisted on continuing, despite Petrova warning that trying to carry Brianna through the terrain could kill him as well. She reported Brianna's condition to the expedition team before continuing down. I can't fathom having to deliver that news, but I respect her for not sugarcoating it. False hope up there. It's just another way to die. Investigators later pieced together Brianna's final hours from Akar's account, radio traffic, her last confirmed positions, the state of her oxygen system, and Dr. Petrova's assessment. They concluded she most likely lost consciousness after the descending teams left, with no supplemental oxygen or safe way to continue down. Because her body was never recovered, the exact cause and timing remained uncertain. Akar stayed with Brianna as long as he safely could, keeping her secured beside the fixed line and repeatedly trying to get her upright. He continued communicating with his expedition team, reporting that she was no longer responsive and that he was becoming dangerously depleted himself. Eventually, his expedition leader ordered him to descend. Continuing to remain beside an unconscious climber without oxygen would have created another casualty without giving Brianna a realistic chance of being moved safely. Akar made one final attempt to reposition her securely out of the main traffic line, then began his own descent alone, looking back with every step he took. Nobody watched her die. Nobody filmed her final moments. The incident reached South Col before the survivors did. Dr. Petrova and other climbers reported Brianna's severe deterioration and oxygen depletion during the descent, but the altitude, terrain, and lack of oxygen made a rescue attempt too dangerous. By the time organizers could respond, Brianna was no longer recoverable. Brianna's death was believed to result from severe altitude illness, suspected haze, and profound hypoxia. Because her body was never recovered, no definitive autopsy was possible. Her family was notified, and her photos and footage survived separately from her body. Above 26,000 feet, attempting to recover her could have cost another life. Everest doesn't care about your Instagram. That mask came off for a photo, and the mountain took that as payment. Honestly, if you're trading oxygen for a selfie up there, you're not chasing a summit, you're chasing a coffin.